Chapter 2 was called Doing Anthropology. They go through the four fields of anthropology again, except in a different order than we may have done them in the first chapter. So they start off with doing cultural anthropology. I said it was the largest subfield, and it's really in some ways the thing that kicks off US anthropology. And I don't want to be too much of a history of anthropology person, but I do want to throw out a few names of people who wrote very famous books in the past. Books that if you had been a college-age student 100 years ago, or maybe 90 years ago, this book came out in 1934. These were just best-selling books. These were books that you might have looked at or read, despite there probably wasn't that many anthropology classes or professors, really. So one of these books was by Ruth Benedict, titled Patterns of Culture. And the book gets at an essential point, a systematic interpretation of the data. So before Ruth Benedict, a lot of people were into collecting stuff and collecting stories and maybe getting recipes from people about how they used to cook fish. But in some ways, Benedict was able to bring some of these other things together into what she described as more coherent patterns of life. And to do that requires not only just collecting, but analyzing and comparing it with other people. Before your study, you would also want to get whatever you could about that group. In the days of Ruth Benedict and others 190 or 100 years ago, there actually wasn't much to gather. Today, we do have the advantage. You can find somebody probably from a place, and you can talk to them, and you can try to get some language instruction. Maybe you can talk to them on YouTube or over text or something like that to get a sense of what that place might be like. And so what Ruth Benedict and others started doing is this thing that we call an ethnography. It is intensively trying to research and then illustrate the patterns of culture. So we talked about how people's lives are patterned by the inheritance that they have from their past generations, as well as their peers. We always have to remember that those patterns are always changing. And we have to remember that not everyone is going to follow exactly the same pattern. We're not robots controlled by our culture, but we nevertheless can see these overarching themes in a society. So many of you were interested in how we did the ethnography thing and the idea of participant observation. So another name for you, Margaret Mead, perhaps the most famous US anthropologist of all time. And she was a contemporary of Ruth Benedict. Benedict was her teacher. They had a long-term same-sex relationship as well, off and on, although they were also both in heterosexual marriages, but things were complicated. So Margaret Mead goes off to Samoa and, guided by this idea of cultural relativism, are trying to figure out what people's practices are within their own society, wrote one of maybe the best-selling book of anthropology of all time, the 1928 book, Coming of Age in Samoa. If you had been a student or a person 90 years ago, Margaret Mead was a household name. It was a very popular book. And in part, it was because what Margaret Mead was describing among the Samoan girls was that as they came of age, they seemed to have relatively more freedom than the girls that were coming of age in US society in terms of their sexual expression, in terms of the way that they could have more than one sexual partner before getting married. And their lives seemed to be, in some ways, less stressful than US adolescents. And so Margaret Mead developed this idea that, in fact, it's not necessarily that we wanted to be like the Samoans, but that in our own society, we could look to other societies and then take those lessons back for how we might alter the trajectory of our own society. Mead claimed that, in fact, although we all biologically go through adolescence, the biological phase, that just because our home hormones are raging doesn't mean we're going to rebel against our parents necessarily. In fact, the Samoan girls didn't feel that adolescence was necessarily a time of rebellion because they didn't feel the strictures that were in place in US society at the time. So this was a mind-blowing revelation to American society. People were just buying this book and reading it on their own and hiding it from their parents because it spoke to how notions of sexuality and gender were shaped by our society and were not necessarily one natural or one God-given thing, which you could only do in one way. So people took up these ideas from early on to try and think about their own society. Now, the goal of anthropology is to try and get this perspective of people from the inside, from within, in their own society. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we agree with what people are doing. It doesn't mean we necessarily accept everything that goes on in different societies, but we are trying to at first describe the perspective of insiders in this society. It's a pretty extensive process. It's probably never done, really. You want to be there at least a year to get a sense of the cycle of life, but really you'll never really be an insider, but you try as best you can to talk to different people. Some of you mentioned key informants, people who have different perspectives on their society, to get the different things that are going on in a society. So I've given you some examples of old anthropologists from about 100 years ago, Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead's book, Coming of Age in Samoa. These days, of course, anthropologists have to go wherever the people are. That's when you go online and you meet people online because that's where they are. In fact, they're more often you can find them online than face to face. Sometimes you're looking right at them and they're somewhere else. They don't know where they are. That weird virtual thing, yes. Right, yeah, he actually did his field work in a video environment. You got to go where the people are. And in this case, they were doing this thing called Second Life, where they had avatars. So Tom Boellstorff wrote a book called Coming of Age in Second Life. You can see he's indebted to Mead because Mead's talking about coming of age in Samoa, but this is coming of age as an avatar and something like a video game that used to be played. So you got to go where people are. Increasingly, as we go where people are, anthropologists have become more aware of what we call positionality and reflexivity. And this is a picture of Ruth Behar talking to one of the people she interviewed, and then a drawing actually by the interviewee of the process they went through to do this. Obviously, we want to be, how to say, as objective as possible. We don't want to impose our own views on another society, but we also have to recognize that we all inhabit, that if you are doing an ethnography, you are inhabiting your own body and you are a person in this society. You have a perspective and you have to talk to people, and that talking will have an influence on the other people in that society. And so being reflexive about this, about your positionality, about where you stand in relationship to the people you're studying, can be quite important, because the knowledge that you gather is not just out there to be gathered, it's determined in some part by who you talk to in the community and when you talk to them and where and who you are as an anthropologist. You don't necessarily want to go overboard on this, and some people get really into being reflexive and thinking about themselves perhaps too much. You still want to be studying the perspectives and getting the insider perspective of others. But these are important lessons that we have for doing ethnography or cultural anthropology today. Even though there are many anthropologists who engage in these kinds of interpretive or narrative ideas. It is also important, there are a lot of cultural anthropologists who do use quantitative data and hypothesis testing. And so this picture is of Victoria Reyes Garcia doing field work and talking about how people's local ecological knowledge, their knowledge of plants and animals, and really trying to get a quantitative sense of how people were surviving in this environment and how people's knowledge influenced their, in this case, hunting, fishing, and gathering practices. So, although some anthropologists tend toward the more ethnography, interpretive side, there are others who are doing this more quantitative hypothesis testing work. Our second section, 2.2, is on doing linguistic anthropology, recording indigenous languages and songs and trying to figure out what was happening as they were, in some ways, they were losing some of these languages. And so some of the early linguistic anthropology was about just recording these languages before they went away or disappeared. So in this case, before we had DNA evidence of where indigenous peoples or peoples who were first in the Americas, Native Americans, came from, some of the early anthropologists hypothesized that the language families linked these indigenous people to the area of Siberia and Asia, and that's probably where they migrated from. This has later been corroborated with DNA and more archaeological evidence, but the evidence was already there linguistically for a back and forth migration in the Siberian Asian area and into the Americas. This map is a little strange. It's showing us the polar region, and here we are somewhere down in New York, but this is the polar region of Alaska to Siberia. Why are they losing those languages anyway? Here we have these linguistic anthropologists trying to record the languages that were being lost. But the truth of the matter is that the government policy was to stamp out and get rid of the languages. In part, they'd have policies where they'd put Native American children in boarding schools and take them out of their families, and then they'd prohibit them from speaking their indigenous language. So it's important to realize that although some of the linguistic anthropologists were trying to help and preserve some of these languages, the official policy was to stamp them out and get rid of them as we enculturated them into US life. In today's world, linguistic anthropologists are also concerned about language loss and language preservation, but they also do, like cultural anthropologists, field work, participant observation. I showed you a picture before of Jonathan Rosa's work in Chicago among this bilingual Spanish and English speakers. This is a picture of Erin Moriarty Harrelson, who's doing work on sign language, the emergence of a new sign language in Cambodia. So to do that, you have to do that immersive participant observation. And so there's a lot of overlap between cultural anthropology and linguistic anthropology today. Section 3 was on doing archaeology. The first thing that we should do when we're doing archaeology is to do an archaeological survey, which can be done by walking around, be done from a plane, from a satellite. Increasingly, we're using different forms of radar and technologies to map out regions. And doing an archaeological survey in this perhaps more technological or photographic lab work is extremely important, because although most of you want to do something else in archaeology, this gives us a broad picture of what is going on in an area to map out all the possible sites. But for most of you, what do you really want to do? Yeah, you want to do some excavation, get some dirt in your hands and go dig up some stuff. So excavation is a very important part of archaeology. There are a couple things that we should realize about it. One is that it gives us a lot of knowledge about a very small part. So in some ways, the larger archaeological surveys give us more knowledge about broader issues. The excavations give us a lot of knowledge about a small part of the site. The other thing about excavation, it destroys the site. So it is destructive and you have to be very careful. So when you're doing your excavation, you also have to be slow and systematic and scientific and record all the stuff, because once you're done, it's never going to be the same site again. This is a picture of something that is super cool, is maritime archaeology. A lot of the artifacts that we need, to example, for tracing migrations of peoples are underwater. And that's a form of possibly destroying a site, but it's also can be a way of preserving a site. So there are specific programs in maritime archaeology where you get to dive and look for artifacts that way. This is an example of lapita pottery. What's that called? Yeah, this is incredible. You have this pottery and then you find it not just here, but way out here. A couple thousand years ago, people got into these boats laden with chickens, pottery, stuff, and just sailed eastward. They didn't know what they would find out there, but they were pretty sure they were more islands. And it's one of the most incredible migrations in human history, because you set sail and you were never coming back. You were going to set up shop there. And with the evidence for it is in their archaeology. And so people sailed eastward all the way out to Easter Island off the coast of Chile, where they eventually put up those big Easter Island heads. We talk about the voyages of Columbus or other European explorers. These people were getting in canoes and sailing out to colonize new islands where there weren't people. They knew they weren't coming back, but they were convinced that there were going to be more places to settle out there. For the most part, they were probably lost a few ships too, you would say. But yeah, it was a pretty amazing migration, which we see through these ceramics, through the pottery. Your fourth section is called Doing Biological Anthropology, Human Biological Variation. We're going to be talking about why people look different from each other, how that happened and why, and what it means. And then after that, we'll be talking about human evolution and human biology in the context of evolution. So that will be your new favorite method or idea. The fifth section of this is called Improving Anthropological Practice. They use a couple big words here. They use the word decolonizing. I'm not going to claim that I am able to participate in a decolonizing anthropology. For me, what this is most about, or what I think I can do, and we've talked about this, is instead of trying to make studies of other people, instead of studying people as if they were outside of us, that we have an ethics where we try to have our research guided by the people themselves and try to learn from them and with them. And with that, to try and engage in what we might call decolonizing practices, which is technically about trying to get rid of some of the ideas that we had, the colonial ideas, about who has knowledge and who doesn't have knowledge, and whose languages, for example, are valuable and whose languages are not. So this is a thing in which anthropological practice still needs to be improved. They also use another big word called decanonization. Again, I'm not sure if I can decanonize anything, but for me, this falls under what I've talked about as a generous spirit in anthropology, generous inclusivity, in which we look to the knowledge practices, both of scientists, humanists, of artists, of people across various disciplines, but also local knowledge practices as well. So a canon, C-A-N-O-N, refers to those books that you were supposed to read. in a given discipline. And to have a decanonization is to try and open that field up to a number of different perspectives. So Ruth Benedict, Patterns of Culture, and Margaret Mead's Coming of Age in Samoa might be considered canonical books of the canon. And so decanonization is to take those into account, but maybe widen the scope of this. It relates to what I want to talk about a little bit now, which is here we are in an anthropology class. I'm teaching you an introduction to anthropology. I'm talking about how anthropology needs to be improved. And you might be wondering, well, why does anthropology need to be improved? Why am I studying something in which we're trying to be improved? Yes, anthropology may need to be improved because, as we talked about with indigenous languages and the way in which they were officially unrecognized and tried to be stamped out, anthropology as an academic discipline, when we talk about some of these famous anthropologists like Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead, came out of this period of pretty intense colonialism in a time when European and US societies were expanding. And the poor Bonaba people, yes, the colonization process was pretty intense because they took these people. We had talked about the wonderful, beautiful migration of Lapita pottery and people going out and finding new homelands in these islands. And then later on this one island, they discovered that there was a valuable thing for making fertilizer. So they took the people from this island, took them all off the island and put them on another island so they could mine that island and remove basically all the phosphate from it. Yes, it was a drastic process of colonization. It was insane. And so what happened is the world, and we in this country have all benefited from that process because what it set up was this hierarchy of peoples in which some people were allowed to be moved off their homelands and moved away from their islands so that other people could take those resources. Now, as we talked about, anthropologists, more than any other academic discipline, were the ones who did speak out against these stereotypes and hierarchies. So people like Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict and many others did value indigenous knowledge, indigenous contributions, and were trying to at least speak up against some of the stereotypes of the time. But at the same time, we do have to admit that a lot of anthropological research was done in this extractive mentality, where people would take other people's objects or dig up other people's graves, or take other people's knowledge and only publish it in languages in which they were unable to comprehend, or display their writings in museums where they were not able to access them, or to take their bones and put them into music and to take them for so-called scientific study, or just to take them away. Again, anthropology has historically been people who look like me studying people who are indigenous or in a different society. And so this hierarchy of knowledge and power has in some ways been preserved over time. Remember when I gave you the Naki Rama to read, the issue of who studies whom in anthropology. Now, hopefully, someday there will be more diverse people up here at the podium and in anthropology. But we are certainly not there yet. Perhaps we might be even going backwards on this one. So anthropology does need to take account of both its own disciplinary history, its own positionality, you might say, as well as its role within the power structures which give us our world today. One of the goals of something like decanonization is to also show us some people in the past who probably should have been included in the books that you have read. So Ruth Benedict's book, Patterns of Culture, was a bestseller. Margaret Mead's book, Coming of Age in Samoa was a bestseller. Ella Cara Deloria was a contemporary of both Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict and studied with some of the same people. She was an indigenous person, a Native American, who did her own anthropological work. Traditionally, though, she hasn't been part of the readings or the canon of anthropology, and she passed away penniless and pretty much unnamed, and it's only later that people went back and looked at her work. W.E.B. Du Bois is a little more famous. You might read him in sociology or in ethnic studies class or even in history class. His most famous book is perhaps The Souls of Black Folk, but he also wrote what might be considered an ethnography of African Americans in Philadelphia. And he again talked to someone that was a contemporary academic and talked to people like Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict and other anthropologists at the time. He should certainly be considered to be just as much of an anthropologist as they are, but traditionally he is not really read within the canon of anthropology. Or Zora Neale Hurston, who you may have read in a literature class, one of the now most famous US African-American women novelists, but she began her life as an anthropologist. She was trained with Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead, that whole Columbia School of Anthropology, and did more field work than any of them, but she did her field work in the American South, among Black people in the American South, at a time when that was not considered to be real anthropology or real culture. So she never got to have an academic position. She had some best-selling novels for a while, but then when she also passed away, she was basically penniless and forgotten. It wasn't until the 1970s when some of the new Black feminist authors recognized her work that her work was resuscitated and is now included. But again, somebody who could have been included in anthropology, in the anthropological canon, the official works, and should be as a way of thinking about these ideas that we have set up today.